Hopefully, whether you're doing a PhD or indeed you're doing some other piece of research that needs a supervisor, you won't be in this situation. There are a lot of very amusing strips from PhD comics about the frustrations of being a PhD, studying for a PhD. But this, of course, is the kind of supervisor we do not want. And it does happen. So it's worth doing a bit of research and thinking carefully about who would best supervise or mentor you in your research journey. Just to give you some examples of the importance of a research supervisor, and I've put in it, for example, PhD, because we could be talking about mentorship, or we could be talking about a supervisor for a PCAF, for example. But these are quotes from various websites that I've looked at. A PhD supervisor can make or break a candidate's progress. It's estimated that roughly half of all PhD candidates in North America do not complete their doctoral studies due to a lack of support from their supervisor. So it is pretty critical. And I know from my own peer group, when I took my PhD, it made a big difference, whether you got on with your PhD supervisor, whether they delivered. So it's definitely worth trying to find the right people to support you. The quality of the PhD supervisor candidate relationship, the PhD candidate's sense of belonging, the amount of freedom in the project, and working on a project closely related to the supervisor's research were positively related to satisfaction and negatively to quit intentions. And that was actually a piece of research. You can see it's referenced. So people do research on PhD supervisors, and you can see there some of the important things that you need. I want to talk just very briefly about my own PhD supervisor, because I was actually very lucky in having Sarah Curtis as my supervisor when I undertook my PhD many years ago. I was in fact her first PhD student, but despite that she did an exceedingly good job, and I completed within 3 years. So what did she do as a PhD supervisor? Well, firstly, she acted as a guide and mentor through the academic world. So, she would suggest conferences that we should go to, and to begin with, she would come with me, and then she would let me fly on my own. She was a source of good methodological advice. So obviously the piece of work that I was doing was looking at damp housing and health in East London, and it required various quantitative methods, surveys, and indeed measurements on both people and houses. And she pointed me in the direction of all the people that I needed to have advising me in terms of equipment that I needed. And she herself was an expert in questionnaire design, and so helped me through that. She was very much a facilitator for my project work. And I think one of the wisest things she said to me was that, it's not all about data acquisition. I think as a PhD student, you say, I've got to have the data, must have the data. And of course, ultimately, you do need to have the data, but you don't want to rush into it. It's got to be carefully planned, because otherwise you'll end up with a lot of data that's not very helpful. So pacing you is something that a supervisor should do. She was a source of useful contacts, as I've said, in terms of people that I needed to deliver the research, but also generally in terms of the progression of my academic career. So she could point me in the direction of people who were working in my field and introduce me to them. She ensured safe working practices, which is something we must all be aware of. I was trudging around various estates in London. It was important that things were in place. And obviously, if you are undertaking research as health professionals working in the community, you're very well aware of this. You need to have safe working practices, and making sure that when you're collecting data in the evenings or in dark places, that there is a procedure in place. So she ensured safe working practices. As I said, she helped pace my work sensibly. She allowed me to develop my own path. So I wasn't doing exactly the same research as her. It was research that was related to her. It was research that she had a great interest in. But I was, whilst working alongside her, working towards moving away into my own independent path. She gently challenged me to reach my potential. Nudging me, encouraging me to do things, showing me how to do things. She didn't insist on being on my publications. As I say, to begin with, we had 1 or 2 publications together, but when it came to the PhD thesis itself and publishing that in journals, there was no hint that she was trying to steal my thunder, and she left it to me to publish on my own. and she saw me very nicely through my Viva, which was fine. You know, I passed the PhD, but there were corrections, and I just got a job, and it was all very stressful trying to get corrections done at the same time as starting a new job. And she was very supportive in that. So she saw me beyond the PhD Viva to actually getting the PhD signed off. So she was a great supervisor, and I think I was tremendously lucky. And I know a lot of people who have been a lot less lucky. What's more, we're still talking to each other, and that's, I think, it is 33 years later. In fact, I met her in Edinburgh just a few weeks ago, and we had a nice cup of coffee. So we're still in touch, and we still like each other, which is really good. So what is the job of a research supervisor, whether it's a PhD supervisor or mentor? Well, the job of a supervisor is to use their own experience and expertise to help support you throughout your research project. And remember that if you are undertaking one of the clinical practice practitioner fellowships or awards, you also need a clinical or practice supervisor alongside your academic supervisor. So just bear that in mind. If you're progressing as you do with some of the NIHR schemes, both clinically or in practice, as well as academically, you do need a supervisor to tick both, you know, a supervisor for each of those areas that you're working in. So what makes a good research supervisor? Well, someone, I think, who has substantial research experience. There's no point having a novice supervising you. You need someone who knows the ropes. You need someone who has some good quality research outputs. So you can look at where they publish and see whether it's sort of appropriate to their career stage. They need to be up to date in your area of interest. Now, that may be that they're encouraging you to make sure that you're updated in the area. If they're working in a related field, there may be some specific literature searching that you have to do, and they will assist you in that. But they will make sure that they are reasonably au fait with the area that you're looking at. Obviously, if you're applying for a PhD, for example, that is based at a university that already has a research question related to it, your supervisor will almost certainly be an expert in that area anyway, because that's why they want a PhD student working in the field with them. You need someone who will stay put through the duration of your study. So if someone is planning to leave and they're going somewhere inaccessible, then it's probably best not to have them as your supervisor. You have to think carefully about the degree of experience that you want in your supervisor. Obviously, I've said you need substantial research experience, but if you get someone who is very prestigious, so Professor X, Y, or Z, but they're tremendously busy, yes, they'll be an expert in your field, but will they be available to you when you need their help? Versus someone who perhaps is still got a research track record, but is more junior and therefore perhaps more available. It's worth looking at previous supervisees and see where they're at and whether they completed successfully and what they're doing. I think someone who has excellent organisational skills, both theirs and yours, will be key to success. So somebody with clear expectations of what they want from you, someone who's prepared to give you deadlines so you don't drift around and it's easy to see your years disappearing, actually. So making sure that you've got deadlines and you don't drift around, and that you're roughly to schedule in terms of getting your PhD done. Someone who's flexible. I mean, things come up, interesting things occur, and you need to have a bit of flexibility there. And someone, importantly, who is willing to help and available to you. So they do want to, they actively are keen to help you, and that they will be available to help you when you need them. You're looking also for someone who's a good fit for you. So someone who's enthusiastic about your work, someone who's quite inspiring about their own research interests, and you can feel that enthusiasm. A good mentor when you really need to knuckle down and get some work done. Finding the right balance for you, whether you want a really hands-on supervisor or whether you want someone who you check in with every now and again. And that might vary throughout the course of the project that you're doing. So you may have slightly more intensive mentorship or supervision early on, which will then become less frequent as you advance with the project that you're undertaking. In terms of a supervisory team, if you're undertaking a project, you need someone who knows about the methods that you're going to use, someone who's au fait with the clinical or practice problem that you're addressing, and someone who can guide you in terms of the training that you will require. It's rather like any kind of research grant and any scheme. You need to have the team who can deliver, and that is you plus your supervisory team. How to find a good supervisor? Well, the bottom line is do your research. And there are ways in which you can do that. Firstly, obviously, you need a fairly clear idea of your area of interest. You're then in a position to find experts in your area. Now, that might be that you're looking at the papers that you're reading and you're seeing who's publishing largely in your area. It may be that you can browse university websites and do more general searches to find out who's doing what where. You can make a short list and you can read up on these people. So, you know, find out what they say on their departmental website, whether they've got any Twitter. You can find out what projects they're currently involved in. As I say, find out about previous supervisees and what happens to them. You want to know that they have a good trajectory and that they do finish the project that they were assigned to do or had decided to do. You need to look at university and departmental facilities. It depends on what kind of work that you're doing, but obviously you need to be in an institution that can support you with whatever research you're doing. So if it's lab-based, you obviously need those facilities to hand. You know, if you're doing some very large computing, you need to make sure that those facilities are there. If you're approaching a supervisor yourself, so you're not necessarily applying for a designated PhD, so for example, for an NIHR fellowship, you'd want to approach a supervisor or potential supervisor at some point. Approach them with a summary of what it is that you want to do, a little bit about yourself, potentially when you want to start, and the sorts of funders that you have thought of to date, because they may come up with other ones that you haven't thought of. You do actually have to sort of interview your potential supervisor. You want to sit down and have a chat to them, or have considerable email chats with them to make sure they're the right person for you. Ideally, get an opportunity to talk to their research team or current students or co-authors just to see how they've behaved. Not everyone is well behaved, and academe is renowned for its fisticuffs at times. So it's good to get someone who's amiable, someone who fits with your personality and who you will get along with. So get a feel, I guess, for the workplace culture. You know, is it a very strict culture where there's a strict hierarchy and you'll be a bit of a dog's body, or is it one that's really nurturing and will offer you opportunities whenever they arise? Some red flags. So these are taken from an article by Gemma Conroy, and her red flags are as follows. If a potential supervisor is difficult to pin down for a meeting, they are unlikely to treat their students as a priority down the line. So it's just something to bear in mind. If a potential supervisor seems to prefer working alone or doesn't include students as co-authors on their papers, it's unlikely that they will help the candidates build their CVs. And you do have to watch out sometimes if you are working on a project and that project is led by your supervisor. You want to make sure you're not just being viewed as a methodologist or a spare pair of hands. This is about developing yourself as a researcher, not just getting a research project done. Too much emphasis on publishing papers can be a sign that the potential supervisor lacks integrity. That's quite a bold statement, and isn't focused on helping their students' skill development. So yes, it's about your career development as well as getting a research project done. Prospective supervisors who expect candidates to work on weekends or be on call outside of working hours are likely to be more interested in the students' productivity than their growth and development. That might be the case. Obviously, there are some research projects, especially in the clinical domain, where you might have to go and collect data late, late at night or at a clinic, or you may be out interviewing people, in certain contexts and environments that are a bit antisocial, but that is part and parcel of research sometimes. I've already mentioned this earlier on, but it's an important word on PhDs and universities. As I said earlier, whilst many fellowships and schemes that you can apply for are for your research idea, so they're kind of response mode, if you like the NIHR fellowships, supervisors often look for PhD students for their ideas. Under those circumstances, funding and supervision is often automatically provided. It's not always the case. Sometimes, you can apply for a PhD that's advertised at university, but if you're not high enough up on their funding list, they sometimes will offer you a place and not funding. And that's something you have to watch out for. And indeed, I have come across quite a few PhD students who have landed a place, but then find they're not really funded for it. So you need to make sure that if you are applying to a university for an advertised PhD, you need to know the status of the funding. And it may be that you have to wait to find out on the competition for the funds available within the university as to whether, for example, you get one of their doctoral centre scholarships, for example. But obviously, if you're applying to the NHR for your own personal fellowship, that's not such an issue. And I mentioned earlier that universities have their internal deadlines for PhD places in particular that can be quite separate from funding deadlines, and you must be aware of these, and you must put in an application for your department, because even if you come with your wonderful NIHR fellowship, they won't be able to offer you a place if they've reached their cap. A few comments from funding panels, and these are NIHR funding panels. This is the Doctoral Research Fellowship Chairs report. Applicants lacked supervision in methodological, qualitative and statistical support. When developing their project, applicants should identify any areas where expertise may be lacking and look to add a supervisor in this area to their supervisory team to address this gap. It's the same issue with any research project. You will not get the funding if the correct team is not there to deliver the work. Unfortunately, many promising candidates were unsuccessful this year because of insufficient supervision in terms of preparation of the application itself and throughout the timescale of the proposed fellowship. So again, if you are trying to put a project together and you're not getting the input that you need, the person that you're working with is perhaps not available enough for you. Maybe that they're just too busy to help you. A report from the PCAF chair. The PCAF panel are looking for the availability of the supervisor and the time commitment required, the fit of the supervisor's expertise with the stated area of research, the record of conversion of masters to PhD students. They want to have at least one supervisor who has doctoral research supervision experience, and that's for a PCAF. So people with experience of supervising. And the combined experience of supervisors, should provide the necessary expertise. So again, it's all to do with whether the team as a whole, including yourself, can deliver the project and that you're not all on your own trying to do it. So there are various forms of PCAF, as we've talked through, that the full PCAF can propose interim supervisors appropriate for a PCAF, and plans to identify doctoral supervisor over the course of the award can be put in place. So you can change your supervisor. If you have the PCAF bridge, which is the other version of the PCAF where you're ready, for example, have a master's and you're ready to work towards a doctoral fellowship, the supervisory team that you have for your PCAF bridge can segue or should segue into the doctoral supervision that you're planning. Some quotes about supervisors. To get the most from your supervisor, you have to be interested in what they do. So again, showing interest in the work that they're doing, and indeed there should be a degree of overlap, certainly in methods, if nothing else, in terms of your interests. Over the course of 3 years, it's crucial to have someone who can encourage you when your experiments fall flat, challenge you when you become cocky, and help you steer towards successfully submitting your thesis, from Simon Singh. So very much a mentorship role, steering you through your early steps in research. The real issue is to see whether the chemistry is right. Think about whether your prospective supervisor seems like the sort of person who will be there when you need them. And that's from Susan Greenfield. If you're not at your most motivated, an absent or distant PhD supervisor can be a recipe for months of procrastination, and you will be amazed at how time passes. And if you haven't, done the work required, it's very difficult then to sometimes extend your PhD because obviously the funding runs out. Too many students get caught up in the PhD topic or project, but it's about building skills that can help you pivot into what you want to do next. The outcome of PhD is not about output, but who you are as a scientist. So of course, outputs are important, and it's good to see publications from PhDs and PhD work, and that's what people will be looking for in the next stage of your work. But the PhD is not just a research project. It is different. So a fellowship is different from a project grant. It's all about developing you as a person as well as delivering a piece of research.